Eleanor Grayson sat at the head of the mahogany table in her corner office, the city skyline sprawling beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. At 68, she was a vision of elegance and power, her silver hair swept into a flawless chignon, her cream suit tailored to perfection. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the city below and the soft rustle of papers as she reviewed the quarterly reports of Grayson Enterprises, the empire she had built from a single real estate deal 4 decades ago. Her fingers, adorned with a single emerald ring, moved with precision, but her mind was elsewhere. A shadow had crept into her life, one she hadn't anticipated after 40 years of marriage. She had always been the architect of their success, while her husband, Richard, charmed clients with his easy smile and silver tongue. Eleanor was the strategist, the one who turned his charisma into contracts, investments, and a fortune that spanned continents. She controlled every asset not out of greed, but out of necessity. Richard's impulsiveness, his tendency to leap before looking, had nearly cost them everything in the early years. She'd taken the reins, and he'd been content to let her. Or so she thought. The first hint of trouble came a month ago, a fleeting moment she'd almost dismissed. A late-night phone call Richard took in the garden, his voice low and secretive, followed by a hurried explanation about a business associate. Then there were the unexplained absences, the new cologne, the way his eyes avoided hers at dinner. Eleanor, ever observant, began to piece together the fragments. She wasn't a woman to jump to conclusions, but she wasn't one to ignore them either. She hired a discreet investigator, a decision that felt like a betrayal of her own heart. But she needed the truth. The report arrived that morning, tucked into a plain manila envelope. Eleanor opened it with steady hands, but her pulse quickened as she read. Richard, her husband of 40 years, was planning a secret wedding. Not a renewal of their vows, not a surprise for her, but a wedding to someone else, a woman named Cassandra, 32, with auburn hair and a laugh that, according to the investigator's notes, lit up the room. The photos showed them together at a seaside cafe, Richard's hand resting on hers, his face alight with a joy Eleanor hadn't seen in years. She leaned back in her chair, the weight of the betrayal settling into her bones. The empire she'd built wasn't just financial, it was their life, their legacy. Every asset, from the penthouse in Manhattan to the vineyard in Tuscany, was in her name. Richard had forgotten that. Or perhaps he'd never truly understood. He'd always been the dreamer, the one who believed wealth was a game, not a fortress. And now, he was gambling with their future, unaware that Eleanor held every card. She could confront him, demand answers, let the hurt spill out in a torrent of accusations. But Eleanor Grayson didn't unravel. She planned. She strategized. If Richard thought he could rewrite their story without her, he was about to learn how wrong he was. The office door opened, and her assistant, Margaret, stepped in, her expression cautious. Mrs. Grayson, your 3 o'clock is here. The board meeting. Eleanor nodded, her face a mask of composure. Give me 5 minutes. Margaret. As the door closed, she opened her desk drawer and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. It was her private ledger, not of finances, but of promises, hers and Richard's, written in the early days of their marriage. She hadn't looked at it in years, but now she flipped to a page where Richard had scrawled, "To Eleanor, my anchor, my everything." Her throat tightened, but she closed the journal with a snap. Sentiment wouldn't serve her now. Control would. She stood, smoothing her suit, and walked to the window. The city glittered below, a testament to her resilience. Richard's secret wedding was a betrayal, but it was also a miscalculation. He'd forgotten who controlled every asset he owned, not just the money, but the life they'd built together. And Eleanor was about to remind him. Her phone buzzed on the desk. A text from Richard, dinner at La Belle tonight. Just us. The irony twisted in her chest. She typed a reply. Her fingers steady, of course. Darling. I wouldn't miss it. Tonight, she would play the part of the devoted wife. But tomorrow, she would begin to unravel his plans. Richard had started this game, but Eleanor would finish it. 1,000 words. La Belle was a sanctuary of crystal chandeliers and hushed conversations. The kind of place where secrets were whispered over vintage wine. Eleanor sat across from Richard, her smile as polished as the silverware. He looked handsome tonight, his gray hair neatly combed, his navy suit crisp. At 70, he carried an air of youthful charm, the same charm that had won her heart decades ago. But now, she saw the cracks: his nervous glance at his phone, the way his laughter felt rehearsed. You look stunning, Ellie, he said, raising his glass. To us. She clinked her glass against his, her eyes never leaving his face. To us, she echoed, her voice warm but laced with steel. She wondered if he could sense it, the shift in her. She'd spent the afternoon with her lawyer, reviewing the intricate web of trusts and holdings that secured their fortune. Every asset, every stock, every property, every offshore account was locked under her name. Richard's signature appeared on nothing. It was a precaution she'd taken years ago, not out of distrust, but foresight. Now, it was her shield. The waiter arrived with their appetizers, and Richard launched into a story about a golf game with an old client. Eleanor nodded, her mind elsewhere. The investigator's report had detailed Richard's plans: a small, private ceremony in the Bahamas, scheduled for next month. Cassandra, the other woman, was a former interior designer who'd worked on their Hamptons estate 2 years ago. Eleanor remembered her: Vigalia bright, ambitious woman with a knack for bold colors. She hadn't thought twice about her then. Now, she was a threat. Ellie, you're quiet tonight, Richard said, his brow furrowing. Everything all right? She tilted her head, her smile unwavering. Just tired, darling. The board meeting was intense. He reached for her hand, his touch familiar yet foreign. You work too hard. Let me take you away somewhere. Just the two of us. The words stung, a cruel echo of the life they'd once planned. She wanted to ask him about Cassandra, to see if he'd flinch, but she held back. Timing was everything. Instead, she squeezed his hand. That sounds lovely. Maybe after the quarterly reports are finalized. He nodded, satisfied, and the conversation drifted to safer topics. But Eleanor's mind was a storm of calculations. She needed more than the investigator's report. She needed leverage, something to ensure Richard's betrayal wouldn't destroy her. She thought of the vineyard in Tuscany, their favorite retreat. It was in her name, like everything else, but Richard loved it dearly. Perhaps it could be bait. Back at their penthouse, Richard retired early, claiming a headache. Eleanor waited until his snores filled the bedroom before slipping into her study. She opened her laptop and drafted an email to her investigator, requesting a deeper dive into Cassandra's background. Financial records, past relationships, anything that could reveal her motives. Eleanor wasn't naive. Cassandra wasn't just a fling. A woman her age didn't ensnare a man like Richard without a plan. The next morning, Eleanor woke to find Richard already gone. A note on the kitchen counter: early meeting. See you tonight. She crumpled it in her fist. The lies were piling up, each one a brick in the wall between them. She called Margaret and canceled her morning appointments. then drove to the Grayson Enterprises archives, a secure facility where decades of documents were stored. If Richard was planning a new life, he might be siphoning assets, however subtly. She needed to be sure. The archives were a labyrinth of steel cabinets and climate-controlled rooms. Eleanor, armed with a list of key accounts, spent hours cross-referencing transactions. She found nothing overt, no large transfers, no hidden accounts, but there was a pattern. Small, irregular withdrawals from a discretionary fund Richard used for client entertainment. Over the past 6 months, they totaled nearly $200. 000. Not enough to cripple their fortune, but enough to fund a secret wedding. A new life. Her chest tightened, not from the money, but from the audacity. Richard thought he could slip away, start over, while she carried the weight of their empire. She closed the ledger and leaned against the cold steel cabinet, her breath shallow. For a moment, she was 28 again, standing beside Richard at their own wedding, promising forever. The memory burned, but she pushed it aside. She wasn't that girl anymore. She was Eleanor Grayson, and she would not be undone. By evening, the investigators sent a preliminary report. Cassandra had a history of short-lived relationships with wealthy men, though nothing criminal. She was ambitious, clever, and currently unemployed, living in a modest apartment paid for by an anonymous benefactor. Eleanor didn't need to guess who that was. She saved the report and began drafting a plan. Richard's secret wedding was a month away. She had time, not much, but enough. 1,000 words. Eleanor's days became a delicate dance of deception. She played the role of the devoted wife, flawlessly cooking Richard's favorite meals, laughing at his jokes, planning a weekend at their lake house. But behind her warm smiles, she was building a case, brick by meticulous brick. The investigators' updates arrived daily, each one painting a clearer picture of Cassandra's world. She wasn't just a gold digger. She was a strategist, much like Eleanor in her youth. The realization was both unsettling and oddly admirable. One evening, while Richard was at a charity gala, Eleanor invited her closest confidant, Vivian, to the penthouse. Vivian, a sharp-witted lawyer in her 70s, had been Eleanor's ally through every major deal. Over glasses of Bordeaux, Eleanor laid out the truth: Richard's affair, the secret wedding, the withdrawals. Vivian listened, her expression shifting from shock to resolve. "You hold all the power, Eleanor," Vivian said, swirling her wine. "But power unused is just a burden. What's your move?" Eleanor leaned back, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "I want him to feel the weight of his choices. Not just the money, but the life we built. I want him to see what he's losing." Vivian nodded. "Then you need to control the narrative. Make him think he's winning. Then pull the rug out." The plan took shape over the next week. Eleanor began transferring key assets into a new trust, one Richard couldn't touch even if he tried. She didn't drain their accounts, that would be too obvious, but she locked down the vineyard, the Manhattan penthouse, and their private jet, citing estate planning updates. Richard, distracted by his secret, didn't notice. He was too busy texting Cassandra, planning their escape. Eleanor also reached out to Cassandra directly, though not as herself. Posing as a potential client, she arranged a meeting at a chic downtown cafe. She wanted to see the woman who thought she could replace her. Cassandra arrived on time, her auburn hair catching the sunlight, her smile practiced but genuine. She was younger than Eleanor expected, her energy vibrant, her eyes sharp with ambition. They spoke about interior design, but Eleanor was studying her every gesture, every word. Cassandra was no fool. She was charming, calculated, and utterly unaware of who Eleanor was. "Thank you for considering me," Cassandra said as they parted. "I'd love to work on your project." Eleanor smiled, her heart a tangle of anger and pity. "I'll be in touch." That night, Richard came home late, smelling faintly of Jasmine Cassandra's perfume. No doubt. Eleanor greeted him with a kiss, her mind racing. She was beginning to understand Cassandra's appeal, the allure of a fresh start. But she also saw her flaws, her overconfidence, her reliance on Richard's promises. Cassandra didn't know the man she was betting on, not the way Eleanor did. The next day, Eleanor met with her financial advisor, a quiet man named Harold who'd managed their portfolio for decades. She instructed him to freeze Richard's access to the discretionary fund, citing irregular activity. Harold raised an eyebrow but complied. By evening, Richard was flustered, unable to explain why his latest withdrawal had been declined. He brushed it off as a bank error, but Eleanor saw the crack in his composure. She decided to escalate. She invited Richard to the vineyard for a weekend, framing it as a chance to reconnect. He hesitated, citing a work trip, but she insisted, her tone leaving no room for refusal. The vineyard was her domain, a place where every grapevine, every stone path, bore her touch. If Richard wanted to play games, she'd choose the battlefield. They arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon, the Tuscan hills ablaze with color. Richard seemed distracted, checking his phone when he thought she wasn't looking. Eleanor played her part, reminiscing about their early years, the summers they'd spent here. "Do you remember when we bought this place?" she asked, pouring him a glass of their private reserve. "We were so young, so sure we'd conquer the world." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We did, didn't we?" She nodded, her heart heavy. "We did. Together." That night, as Richard slept, Eleanor walked the vineyard alone, the stars sharp above her. She thought of the journal in her study, the promises they'd made. She could destroy him, strip him of everything, leave him with nothing but his mistress. But that wasn't enough. She wanted him to choose, to see the life he was throwing away. She wanted him to feel the weight of her love, her strength, her forgiveness or her wrath. 1,000 words. The vineyard was a place of memories, each corner whispering of the life Eleanor and Richard had built. As they walked the grounds the next morning, she watched him closely. He was charming as ever, pointing out the new vines, joking about their first disastrous attempt at winemaking. But his eyes darted to his phone, his fingers twitching with impatience. Eleanor knew he was counting the days to his secret wedding, believing he could slip away unnoticed. She decided to tighten the screws. Over lunch, she mentioned the frozen discretionary fund, her tone casual. The bank flagged some unusual withdrawals. "Darling, I had Harold lock it down until we sorted out." Richard's fork paused midair, his smile faltering. "Unusual? It's just client expenses." She tilted her head, her gaze steady. "Of course. But you know how cautious I am. We can't afford mistakes." He nodded, but his jaw tightened. She saw the panic flicker in his eyes, the realization that his plans were unraveling. She didn't push further, not yet. She wanted him to stew, to feel the walls closing in. That afternoon, she received a call from her investigator. Cassandra had been spotted meeting with a jeweler, discussing a custom engagement ring. The cost was exorbitant, paid for with a credit card linked to Richard's name. Eleanor's stomach churned, not from jealousy, but from the audacity. He was using their money, her money, to build a new life. She thanked the investigator and made a note to have Harold trace the transaction. Back at the vineyard, Eleanor proposed a toast at dinner, raising her glass to Richard, To our legacy, she said, her voice rich with meaning. He echoed her, but his hand trembled slightly. She wondered if he sensed her resolve, the storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. The next day, she took a bolder step. She invited Cassandra to the vineyard, posing as a friend of a friend hosting a charity event. Cassandra, eager for connections, accepted. Eleanor planned the event meticulously, a small gathering of local elites, with Richard in attendance. She wanted him to see them together, to feel the weight of his double life. Cassandra arrived in a sleek black dress, her auburn hair cascading over her shoulders. She was radiant, confident, unaware of the trap. Eleanor greeted her warmly, introducing her to the guests while keeping Richard in her peripheral vision. He froze when he saw Cassandra, his face paling. Eleanor watched as he struggled to maintain his composure, his eyes darting between them. "Richard, darling," Eleanor called, her voice honeyed. "Have you met Cassandra? She's an interior designer. I thought she might have some ideas for the vineyard's guest house." He stammered a response, his charm failing him. Cassandra, oblivious, smiled brightly. "It's a pleasure, Mr. Grayson. Your wife's told me so much about this place." Eleanor's heart pounded, but her smile never wavered. She guided the conversation, keeping it light, while Richard squirmed. By the end of the evening, he was visibly shaken, excusing himself early. Cassandra lingered, chatting with guests, unaware of the drama she'd ignited. That night, Eleanor confronted Richard in their bedroom. "You've been distant, darling," she said, her voice soft but piercing. "Is there something you want to tell me?" He hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "It's just work, Ellie. You know how it is." She stepped closer, her gaze unrelenting. "I know more than you think." He flinched, but she didn't press. She wanted him to confess, to unravel himself. Instead, he turned away, muttering about needing sleep. Eleanor let him go, but her mind was racing. The charity event had been a test, and Richard had failed. Now, she needed to decide her next move. The following morning, she met with Vivian again, this time at a quiet park bench overlooking the river. "He's crumbling," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "But I need to be sure he understands what he's risking." Vivian nodded. "Then show him. Use the assets. Make him see what he stands to lose." Eleanor spent the next few days orchestrating a subtle but devastating display of power. She instructed Harold to send Richard a financial summary, highlighting the assets in her name. She arranged for their lawyer to accidentally send Richard a draft of a new will, one that left him with nothing but a modest allowance. Each move was calculated, designed to remind him of her control without revealing her knowledge of his plans. By the end of the week, Richard was a shadow of himself, jumpy, distracted, his charm replaced by unease. Eleanor watched, her heart torn between love and vengeance. She wasn't ready to end their marriage, not yet. But she was ready to make him choose. 1,000 words. The air in the penthouse was thick with unspoken truths. Eleanor moved through her days with precision, her every action a step in a chess game Richard didn't know he was playing. She'd tightened her grip on their assets, ensuring nothing could be touched without her approval. The vineyard, the jet, the offshore accounts, all were now impenetrable fortresses. Richard, meanwhile, grew more erratic, his excuses flimsier, his temper shorter. One evening, as they sat in their dining room, Eleanor decided to push harder. She slid a folder across the table, her expression neutral. "I've been reviewing our estate plan," she said. "I thought you should see this." Richard opened the folder, his brow furrowing as he scanned the Documenta Revised Trust that named her as sole trustee. His voice was tight. "What's this about?" "Ellie." "Just planning for the future," she said, sipping her wine. "We're not getting any younger." He closed the folder, his hands trembling. "You don't trust me." She met his gaze, her eyes steady. "Should I?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Richard stood abruptly, muttering about a headache, and retreated to his study. Eleanor watched him go, her heart a tangle of resolve and sorrow. She loved him still, despite everything. But love didn't mean surrender. The investigator's next report brought a new twist. Cassandra was pressing Richard to finalize their plans, unaware that his funds were drying up. She'd booked a venue in the Bahamas, expecting Richard to cover the costs. Eleanor smiled grimly as she read the details. Cassandra's ambition was her weakness. She was betting on a man who was already faltering. Eleanor decided to meet Cassandra again, this time as herself. She arranged a lunch at a discreet restaurant, claiming it was about a potential design project. Cassandra arrived, her confidence unshaken, her smile bright. "Mrs. Grayson, it's such an honor," she said, shaking Eleanor's hand. Eleanor studied her, noting the subtle signs of strained tightness around her eyes. A fidgety gesture with her napkin. "I've heard wonderful things about your work," Eleanor said, her tone warm. "I'm considering a full renovation of our Hamptons estate. Richard mentioned you did excellent work there." Cassandra's smile faltered, just for a moment. "He did." Eleanor nodded, leaning forward. "He speaks highly of you. But then, he's always been generous with his praise." The implication landed, and Cassandra's cheeks flushed. She recovered quickly, launching into a pitch about her design philosophy. But Eleanor wasn't listening. She was watching, cataloging every reaction. Cassandra was in love or thought she was. But she was also in over her head. As they parted, Eleanor handed Cassandra her card. "Let's stay in touch. I have a feeling we'll be seeing more of each other." That night, Richard was quieter than usual, his eyes avoiding hers. Eleanor waited until they were alone in their bedroom before speaking. "I met with Cassandra today," she said, her voice calm. "She's quite talented." Richard froze, his tie half untied. "Cassandra? Why?" "For a project," Eleanor said, folding her arms. "You don't object, do you?" He shook his head, but his panic was palpable. Eleanor let the silence stretch, giving him room to confess. He didn't. Instead, he kissed her forehead and murmured, "I'm glad you're keeping busy." The next day, Eleanor escalated her strategy. She instructed Harold to send Richard a detailed financial report, one that outlined every asset in her name. She also arranged for their lawyer to call Richard, clarifying the terms of their estate plan. The message was clear: Richard had nothing without her. By the end of the week, Richard was unraveling. He snapped at their staff, canceled meetings, and spent hours in his study, staring at his phone. Eleanor watched, her heart heavy but resolute. She didn't want to destroy him, she wanted him to choose. To see the life they'd built, the love they'd shared, and decide if it was worth throwing away. On Friday, she found him in the garden, his face haggard. "Ellie," he said, his voice raw. "We need to talk." She nodded, her heart pounding. "I've been waiting for you to say that." 1,000 words. The garden was bathed in the soft glow of dusk, the air heavy with the scent of roses. Eleanor stood beside Richard, her hands clasped, her face serene but unyielding. He looked older tonight, the lines on his face deeper. His eyes clouded with something she hadn't seen in years: vulnerability. "I've made mistakes, Ellie," he began, his voice low. "I got caught up in something. Someone." Eleanor's heart clenched, but she didn't flinch. "Cassandra," she said, her tone flat. His eyes widened, but he didn't deny it. "How did you?" "I know everything, Richard." She stepped closer, her voice steady but laced with pain. "The secret wedding, the withdrawals, the Bahamas. I know because I've always known you better than you know yourself." He looked away, his shoulders slumping. It wasn't supposed to go this far. She was a distraction, a way to feel young again. Eleanor's laugh was sharp, cutting through the evening air. "Young? Richard, we're not young. We're survivors. We built an empire together, and you thought you could trade it for a fantasy." He met her gaze, his eyes pleading. "I love you, Ellie. I always have. I just lost my way." She wanted to believe him, to let the words heal the wound he'd carved into her heart. But trust, once broken, wasn't so easily mended. "You forgot who I am," she said softly. "You forgot who controls every asset you own, not just the money, but the life we made, the promises we kept." He reached for her hand, but she stepped back. "I've locked everything down," she continued. "The vineyard, the penthouse, the accounts. You have nothing without me, and you were ready to throw it all away." Richard's face crumpled, and for the first time, she saw the weight of his regret. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice breaking. "I want you to choose," she said. "Not because I've forced you, but because you see what we have, what we are. But if you choose her, you leave with nothing." The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Richard's eyes searched hers, as if looking for a way out. Finally, he nodded. "I'll end it. I swear." Eleanor didn't respond. Words were cheap. She'd learned that long ago. Instead, she turned and walked back to the house, leaving him in the garden. The next morning, she called her investigator, confirming that Richard had canceled the Bahamas venue. Cassandra, furious, had left a string of voicemails, unaware that her plans were collapsing. Over the next week, Richard tried to rebuild what he'd broken. He was attentive, remorseful, planning dinners and trips, but Eleanor kept her distance. She wasn't punishing him, she was protecting herself. She met with Vivian, who urged her to consider divorce. But Eleanor wasn't ready. She'd spent 40 years building a life with Richard, and she wasn't sure she wanted to dismantle it. Instead, she focused on her empire. She launched a new initiative at Grayson Enterprises, a foundation to support women entrepreneurs, channeling her pain into purpose. The work grounded her, reminded her of her strength. Richard watched from the sidelines, his charm subdued, his presence tentative. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Richard handed her the old leather-bound journal. "I found this," he said quietly. "I reread what we wrote. I forgot how much we dreamed together." Eleanor took the journal, her fingers tracing the worn cover. She didn't open it, not yet. "Dreams aren't enough," she said. "You have to fight for them." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "I'm fighting now, Ellie. For us." She didn't know if she could forgive him, but she saw the man she'd loved, flawed and human, trying to find his way back. Eleanor Grayson was a woman of power, of control, but she was also a woman of love. And love, she knew, was the hardest asset to manage. In the weeks that followed, they began to rebuild, not as they were, but as something new. Eleanor kept her guard up, But she let him in, little by little. The empire she'd protected was intact. But the true victory was in her heart. She reminded Richard and herself of who they were. Together, they'd face the future, not as conquerors, but as partners, flawed and resilient, bound by a love that had weathered the storm. 1,000 words.